every Negro boy and every Negro girl born in this country until this present moment undergoes the agony of trying to find in the body politic, in the body social, outside himself, herself, some image of himself or herself which is not demeaning.
When you look in the mirror, who do you see?
I'm a professor of photography.
I'm an artist.
Also a photographer.
I'm an artist.
I'm a tap dancer.
Do you see yourself now?
There is a self-consciousness that's involved with being who you are.
Do you see yourself in the past? In the future? Do you see yourself through your own eyes?
I don't subscribe to victimology. I'm not a victim.
When you look at a black person, when I look at a black person, African American, me, them, us, you, who do I see? Who do you see? Do I see us now? Do you see us now? Do I see us then? Do you see us then? Do I see us in a time yet to come? Am I looking through a lens, darkly? There are secrets in every family. Sometimes they're buried deeply. And sometimes they're right out there in the open, willfully unseen. There is one place where all the secrets reside. In the family photo album. In what it chooses to represent, and in what is absent, hidden. My secret is connected to the day my father left. On that day, I remember him roughly wiping Vaseline off my face, saying, "Do you want people out there to think you're a greasy monkey?" Inside, I felt shame for the color of my skin, my hair, my lips, my nose. Who would look at me and see not a little boy, but a monkey? What out there had the power to make a father so afraid?
Very early on, I realized there was really something wrong with the way in which the black subject had been imaged vis-a-vis the media. I'd never seen black people look like that. That's sort of like my first early memory, like a deep memory of the photographic image and its distortion of the black subject.
When I was growing up, I didn't like history because everything I heard about me was negative.
As a child at the age of 6, I realized that I am black, and I didn't want to be black.
I knew a world of people who dressed fabulously, who led interesting lives, and who were represented in family albums in a very celebratory way. And I would go into museums and I wouldn't see any of that material at all.
The family album was the world of my grandfather. He had a ritual for any occasion. We would line up before his camera until he got the perfect shot. He gave me and my brother Lyle our first cameras. And encouraged us to follow in his footsteps.
Taking photographs of each other, much part of the ritual of getting together. It had an impact in terms of a sense of self, what it meant to see one's reflection, which is very in counter-distinction to the kind of reflection I might have seen in advertising.
How is the photograph used in the battle between two legacies, self-affirmation and negation. Our salvation as a people, as a culture, depends on salving the wounds of this war. A war of images within the American family album.
The black photographers have the photographs of the black family.
I've been working as an artist in film and photography for the past 20 years, trying to reconcile these two conflicting legacies on a journey that's taken me around the world. As a young filmmaker, I met Deb Willis at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She was doing pioneering work on the history of black photographers, and we became close allies. She put me in my first show and published my first photographs. Together with her and this community of image makers, friends and family, working in parallel journeys, we've joined forces on the battleground of the National Family Album. Our weapon of choice, the camera.
As a student of photography in the 70s, I was amazed and dismayed that there were no African Americans in the history books of photography.
I didn't know anything about the history of black photographers.
I didn't know any black photographers historically.
The history of photography, one book was written in the 30s, another book in the 60s and 70s. Black people were subjects for the photographers, but none of the photographers were African American. My fear was, where are the images of black families that I know and black photographers that I knew from our communities? I decided to embark on a project that has lasted for over 35 years. I wanted to do that because there were images that were unknown. And I thought it was really important for not only an African American audience, but a larger American audience, understand what it meant to have a political history, as well as an artistic history, and a social history in photography. And I found a number of archives throughout America. Photography started in 1839 in France. Jules Lyon, a free man of color, is known for bringing the daguerreotype process back to New Orleans, and he had a studio there. The daguerreotypes of Jules Lyon, I was told by a librarian, did not exist. Then I met photographer Tony Barbosa, who was collecting early photography. He had a daguerreotype by Jules Lyon.
I got excited about, finding out other photographers that were unknown at the time. So I started collecting a lot of daguerreotypes and found balls, daguerreotypes.
James Presley Ball opened a studio in the 1840s in Cincinnati, Ohio.
It's a really interesting town because both got real hardcore slavery defenders and a really hardcore abolitionist community. A lot of his patrons are the wealthy white abolitionists. as well as also well-to-do African Americans.
There was a community of Black photographers. His father worked for him. His brothers Thomas and Robert Ball were working with him, and also Ball's son.
It was really wonderful to discover he had photographs of his mom. It's called Mom Ball, as well as his sisters and some of his brothers.
People did a daguerreotype because they wanted to honor themselves or honor a family member.
The daguerreotypes are on this mirrored surface, and they're very beguiling. Because they're mirror-like, when you look into it, you see a reflection.
Free people of color, authors of their own image. What if our fathers had seen these images? Would they still have been haunted by the way our country sees us? Me, them.
Slavery is something that structures American society. It's there when our laws are being written. It's there when our Constitution is being drafted. It's something that not only it influences American society in the 19th century, it influences American society today.
In 1850, there's a collaboration between Louis Agassiz, a very famous naturalist, and J.T. Zealy, a Daguerrean, and they put together a portfolio of images of enslaved people. You open up this kind of beautiful package, this beautiful frame, but what you're opening it to are people who are stripped of their clothes.
And that's very unusual in early photography in general, even among scientific photography.
The daguerreotypes were produced with this idea of, well, if we pose them in a certain way and show them in a particular light, we'll be able to use these photographs as evidence of how their bodies are indicative of their inferiority.
I stumbled across the Agassiz images.
Family members found buried in an archive. Dahlia, her father, Renty, Jack, his daughter, Drana.
I remember just looking at them over and over and over.
The eyes are one of the most captivating parts of the photograph. Almost all of the subjects are looking straight at the camera, which of course is something that enslaved and free Black people couldn't do in the 18th century and the 19th century. They couldn't look directly at their master or another white person.
She absolutely understands what's happening to her. She absolutely knows already the power of photography. I knew that I couldn't leave them where they were. I couldn't leave them where I found them. If I could reconstruct or build a context for them, that they could take on a new life and a new energy and a new meaning. Something that would question their historical past and at the same time propel them forward into the future. That was sort of my responsibility to that family.
Portraits and family albums. Slaves and masters. in a complicated embrace. How would they choose to show themselves?
Sojourner Truth was the first Black woman to use photography to craft her photographic image. She used photography in two ways. She sold her images to support herself. I sell the shadow to support the substance. She also used the images for self-fashioning. She showed herself as a person of self-possession and a person of great respectability.
Every day we're basically told, you ain't it. You don't look right. I can say, wait a minute, I can change this. I can inject some of my people into these scenarios.
You have individuals like Frederick Douglass who understand not only this larger political battle for abolishing slavery, for enfranchising Black people to vote, but he knows that there's this visual struggle afoot as well.
Negroes can never have impartial portraits at the hands of white artists. If the very best type of European is always presented, I insist that justice in all such works demands that the very best type of Negro should be taken. The importance of this criticism may not be apparent to all. To the Black man, it is very apparent.
He understands that he has to dress in a particular way to get people to rethink their view of African American men at a time when the majority of his brothers and sisters were enslaved.
On the road to freedom, Frederick Douglass created over 150 portraits of himself, making him one of the most photographed Americans of the 19th century. In my grandfather's house, some of these portraits were placed into our album. Along with those of our ancestors and newest arrivals. What would be the cost of losing sight of Douglass's mission, that freedom is inextricably tied to the power to create one's self-image?
I started to really think about the construction of Black male identity, really kind of wondering what it is that kind of shapes us. I really also started to be interested in Black males as commodities in our popular culture and thinking about how slaves were branded as a sign of ownership, and now how so many of us brand ourselves. There's a marriage between creativity and history. Where we come from is not too far off.
The story of Gordon, he was an escaped slave from Mississippi who finds himself on the Union side during the Civil War and is photographed by McPherson and Oliver to show the wounds that he suffered as a result of his life under servitude.
The original Harper's newspaper with that image as an etching published July 4th, 1863, that the Negro has basically saved the nation. And here's a typical Negro who shows so much courage. The photographs don't show a victim, they show the transformation from slave to man, from slave to warrior, from slave to liberator. And he's an American hero. That completely is wiped out of the late 19th century representations of Black people. The Civil War was so important for African Americans in that 186,000 Black men participated in the Union Army and stood before the camera as men. Where they destroy the myth that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Because when you look at those pictures, they are basically projecting an image saying that we basically freed the slaves. We freed ourselves.
Torn between the stories we've been told and the truths we see reflected in these images. What is the reality?
The Reconstruction period was the most revolutionary period in American history to this day. And the photographs of Black people in that period, trying to reconstruct their lives and build their families again. That is the world of the 1860s and 70s.
Think of people of incredibly modest means whose everyday survival was often a struggle to make the kind of financial sacrifice that was required to go to a professional photographer's studio is quite amazing.
Imagine what it means for a generation to go from being property to not only being free and having the right to vote, but serving elected office. To be a senator or a congressman who was once a slave and now passing legislation. Those are the images, I think, are really powerful examples of the best American democracy has to offer. And who's at the forefront? Former slaves.
At this period of rebirth of the nation, could African Americans find their place in the American family album? When I first saw this groundbreaking D.W. Griffith film, Birth of a Nation, depicting the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, I was stunned and hurt by the portrayal of African Americans as less than human. This larger-than-life misrepresentation all but obliterates the individual and collective images of Black families building themselves up in the aftermath of slavery. Like my grandmother's grandmother, Elizabeth, and my grandmother's grandfather, Wallace, both from Charleston, South Carolina. Pictured here in our family's oldest surviving photographs. do you protect a child, a family, a people from being branded as
the cowards,
shiftless,
laziness,
stupid, then shifted to the criminalization of black people and the rise of what was called the black brute. This gave us entree into many ways of controlling black peoples.
Once photography takes off as a commercial medium for a mass market audience, you get all this fake imagery. There's a lot of imageries of staging the kinds of activities that were classified as crimes that got black men arrested during Jim Crow for life. I found tons of stereo views of black men sticking their hands out of windows to steal a chicken. I didn't steal no chicken, sir. This seemingly never-ending barrage of negative representations wield a certain kind of political force, even though they are fictions.
How would African Americans answer Frederick Douglass's call to use the camera to arm themselves in this war of images?
Goodrich Brothers lived in York, Pennsylvania. Preserving family stories was an important aspect for their photographic practice.
When they began to take pictures of one another, take pictures of themselves, have pictures made, and began to put them into photo albums to show to their family members, that's a real light bulb aha moment where you understand a representational system in action.
Family photographs are solid evidence that we exist, that we have a history, that we have these lives that have been largely invisible.
Giving voice to those whose hands once held these images. Photographs that connected one person's eyes with another's heart. This is my mother, my brother. This is my grandmother, my grandfather.
As a child, I was a keeper of our family album. My father and my aunt took a lot of photographs, and at 13, I was given my first camera.
My mother's Deborah Willis. When I was 12 years old, my mother gave me a lot of chrome film. From then on, I really just became fascinated with making images.
My mother gave me a camera for my 13th birthday. And that day, Marian Anderson came to visit the school. So I took pictures of her, and when the pictures came back from the drugstore, everybody wanted some. So I immediately went into business. I've never been an amateur.
My role is the keeper of the family photographs. They are so significant to African American artists because we keep reinventing ourselves through them.
My father never took photographs of us. Me, my brother, our family. If my father had taken photographs, I would have seen the world through his eyes. How would his photographs have connected his heart to mine? And if my country could have seen us the way we see ourselves, would it have found a reflection that connects us all, one to another? These absences have left a hole, wide and deep, making it nearly impossible to connect to a part of myself, the part called love. How does one learn to love oneself or people? Can a photograph bridge a nation divided and heal a wounded heart?
Booker T. Washington was the individual who was seen as replacing the late Frederick Douglass. He was very much interested in presenting African Americans as a nation of people on the rise, as a progressing people.
Mr. President and gentlemen of the Board of Directors and citizens, 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeking the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success.
How would these sons and daughters of former slaves heal their doubts and fears and embrace their humanity? How would they pass on this power of self-invention to the next generation?
Booker T. Washington was very savvy with photography and knew how important photography was to the learning aspect of education. And he had George Eastman on his board. George Eastman helped assist developing a photography department at Tuskegee Institute. The photographer that was head of the photography department was C.M. Batty.
As a student at Tuskegee, I had the good fortune to discover P.H. Polk.
P.H. Polk was a student of C.M. Batty at Tuskegee Institute. He created a series called Old Characters. He decided to photograph some of the former enslaved blacks who lived in that community.
When I first asked him if I could use his camera to learn how to make a picture, he looked at me, he took his time and he says, "You want me to loan you the only camera that I have that I make a living with to learn how to make pictures?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir, Mr. Polk, that's right." He says, "If you're fool enough to ask me, I'm going to be fool enough to help you." So I said, "Well, great." I look at what's absent when I look at the imagery of people of color in this society.
Many of the images that people during that time saw of black folks were very negative. They were seen as being savages who just recently emerged from the jungle. Booker T. Washington had the idea to send a Negro exhibit to the Paris Exposition of 1900. The Paris Exposition was probably one of the largest expositions that had ever been held. The American Negro exhibit was an opportunity to show the progress of African Americans since emancipation.
W.B. Du Bois decided to curate a show that showed prosperity. The exhibition was called A Small Nation of People. He used the portraits photographed by a Black photographer, Thomas Askew, in Atlanta. He wanted them to represent the Black race in a major way.
That European audiences in Paris would look at and say, well, you know, there is a cultural group that I can respect.
The Negro exhibit itself won all kinds of awards. It was a step up in that it emphasized the sort of intellect and the education of African Americans.
What's striking about those within the context of a World's Fair is that they counteract the stereotypical images and displays that were often represented at World's Fairs.
When folks went to see the colonial exhibits, people went to see a sideshow.
Taking Africans from various African tribes and nations and putting them literally in cages to be viewed much like one would view animals in zoos. If you think about how photography was deployed strategically by Booker T. Washington or W.E.B. Du Bois, they understood very clearly the power of this imagery to reshape the understanding of African Americans, not only by white audiences and European audiences, but by African Americans themselves. And that was a political effort to create a new image of the new Negro.
W.B. Du Bois began working for the NAACP, and he had the Crisis magazine. As the editor of the Crisis magazine, he used photography.
Du Bois says we must always present Black people positively and forever striving forward. Participating as full citizens
Full citizenship is what my great-grandfather, Albert Sr., fought to achieve for himself and his true love, Evelyn. Despite a third-grade education, he transformed himself from coal miner in Virginia to a celebrated war hero, and ultimately a personal aide to 3 New York governors. He was a role model for my grandfather, inspiring him to go to college and to take up the camera to begin to document a lifetime of a family, a community, a race, striving forward. And he wasn't alone. What would it take for the images of these citizen photographers to one day reconcile 2 warring ideals, to be an American and Negro?
Black men had returned from World War I knowing that we helped win this war for democracy. And they went immediately to the photograph studio and said, "Take my picture." With a sense of pride and expectation that they would receive their rights. They were also lynched for it in their World War I uniforms because it was considered an affront to the Southern gentry, an affront to white supremacy.
I'm trained to look at images, to understand them, to decode them, and I couldn't look at these pictures.
I think it's a really important step forward to look at how and why this kind of imagery was produced, and to see it not just as a record of these things happening, but as a participant in the process of staging these spectacles.
When you look at the crowd, they often look like they could be at a bar, a picnic, a baseball game. They're smiling, they're happy. You can see some romance between couples. And then if you just look up, you can see bodies hanging.
It's one thing to lynch a person, but where you really get the terror is in the mass-mediated display. The photograph, the postcard.
It's not that they're just found in the South or they're just found in the North. They're everyday, sort of regular, common images. As common as a birthday photograph in a family album.
Why do these painful stories still echo silently amongst us? My grandmother was from South Carolina. I tried to get Nana to talk about the death of her father and the disappearance of her Uncle Thomas. but she always brushed me off with a wave of her hand or changed the subject, leaving gaps and empty spaces.
Look at this man.
Look at this woman.
My mother, her older brother was lynched.
This is a person.
His body was running like a piece of bacon.
Who's tortured and then lynched. Think about this as somebody's baby boy.
My mother had 11 brothers and sisters. They migrated from the South to the North. How you keep in touch with relatives in South Carolina or Virginia, they send you pictures.
How do we unlock the secrets in these images to open possibilities for our own transformation?
Harlem was known as the new Renaissance. There was a rebirth in that community.
People coming through Harlem. Who has that photograph? James Van Der Zee.
When people discovered Van Der Zee's photographs, it's like, oh my God, Black people dressed up?
There's a lot of the new Negro showing itself in Van Der Zee's photographs.
Mr. Van Der Zee. I met him when he was 86 and became friends. He had a wonderful personality.
James Van Der Zee told me one time, get the camera to see it the way you see it.
James Van Der Zee Studio was the theater of desire. He painted backdrops that told different scenarios, different stories about life. And so that studio was really important for them in terms of finding an identity.
They are painstakingly put together in terms of the way people hold themselves, the room, what's on the table, where their hands are, what props are there. So I chose 9 or 10 different images and had them blow out of black glass, the vases and the props from his photographs. And it became this piece that's a homage to James Van Der Zee.
Marcus Garvey hired James Van Der Zee to photograph the Universal Negro Improvement Association.
They came really to Marcus Garvey through Van Der Zee. And the photograph became a document that was suggestive of a larger world, a larger community, a community that was self-sustaining and a community that was political and that occupied social space. I think the photograph is so important because the danger of, let's say, not knowing one's history.
I came to Vanderzee through my grandparents' wedding portrait, prominently displayed in their home. It was a symbol of my grandfather's pride in our people, a testament to an enduring love, untainted by time.
My first show was called The Good Life. It's basically about the notion of the nation using the UNIA flag, the Universal Improvement Association, as being the trope, the red, black, and green. And it was about notions of, let's say, the family of African heritage, but also unspoken issues around, like, say, pleasure and the body and sexuality. I come from, and we help to create a family in which those issues, can be negotiated.
Ironically, in all the images my grandfather had taken, there were no images of my grandmother's first cousin, whose name was also Thomas, but who went by Sugar. Sugar dressed in drag, frequenting the clubs of Harlem's gay underground. My grandfather had to bail her out of jail on many occasions, until one day they found Sugar dead under mysterious circumstances. Why were there no images of Sugar? Yet there are photographs of my father's aunt, my great-aunt Eunice, who also lived her life out in the open, though it was never spoken about or given a name.
I'm one of the lucky ones who's part of my family album.
The family photo album is a place where the family represents itself to itself, but it doesn't represent certain things. Sexuality can be represented in certain kinds of ways and not other kinds of ways.
These are self-portraits that I made in my late teens and 20s. They embody for me such a moment of exploration and innocence. I think that they need to be seen. There's constantly this debate about whether it makes a difference who makes the picture. Yeah, it makes a difference who makes the picture. The work of Black women photographers speaks to me in a way that no other work really can.
My great-aunt's full name was Florestine Marguerite Perrault Collins, and she was a photographer. According to this 1920 census, there were only 101 Black women photographers in the entire country. So Florestine was one of those 101. Florestine became a photographer very much by accident. She needed to go to work when she was 14 in 1909 because she was the oldest member of a family of 6 children. She responded to an ad for a clerk for a photographer. Florestine's self-portraits changes over time. This is a woman who's acquired a certain amount of self-confidence and increasing sophistication.
The first time I remember seeing works by Black women photographers, I was really excited. The curiosity of how they did it, why they did what they did.
Many of the women photographed women who were hairdressers, who owned businesses.
It was a validation of what they had done and how beautiful they were.
The women created spaces. They wanted to create a dialogue for women outside of the studio portrait.
The East Coast, there was Louise Jefferson.
Winifred Hall Allen was in the North.
There's one caricature of Vera Jackson dashing down the street with the Speed Graflex in her hand. She photographed for the LA Sentinel, the African American newspaper. She did Adam Clayton Powell, Dorothy Dandridge, lots of black celebrities during that time.
Florenstein was unique because unlike other black women photographers in that time period, she started the business herself, as opposed to working for or with a husband or a brother. She passed for white for work. That is a strategy that many people employed because the opportunities for African Americans were extremely narrow at that time period. It was just a survival mechanism.
Passing for white. To be free of the burden of blackness. What pain, what dead ends does it leave behind?
Delia was my father's sister, who was very, very light-skinned. As a small child, she was borrowed by a local school teacher who would take her on train trips. Delia was so light, it appeared that her school teacher was traveling with some white child. They could sit in a better class of train seat. Delia got used to that, and in later life, she passed as a white woman. We never had the type of close family ties with Delia because we were obviously black, and she had been portraying that she was not.
My father's family is a mystery to me. They didn't leave many photographs behind. Was the burden of representation so great that they simply did not want to be seen? Images of a pensive boy, my father, arriving on the brink of manhood. Photographs not taken by his father, the father who did not acknowledge him. A grandfather whose name I don't know. Who would make visible the invisible? Who would bridge the void between American and Negro? And at what cost?
When I was young enough to need heroes, Gordon Parks was certainly my hero.
He was the only person out on the level that I saw that like, wow.
I felt the need for me to somehow or another use humanity to get people to become aware of how people suffered. That was what drove me into it. There was always the need possibly to befriend an impoverished family or to help a poor boy, a poor girl, to expose something to the public that I felt was being hidden.
To give Ella Watson an identity and make her stand for Washington and America. The man knew exactly what kinds of pictures to take to tell the story that he wanted to tell.
I just remember my mother and father saying, here's a black photographer working for Life magazine. That was really a source of pride because we really, in terms of media, had been invisible. We have common both opportunities and problems trying to sort of function as image makers in this culture.
When you're a black photographer, you are maneuvering around as well as you can. I remember talking to some lady from Esquire, and I had a beautiful, poetic, romantic idea. And she said, "Oh, that's great. Come up and tell me about it." And then I went into her door, and she looked around. She says, "Where's Hugh Bell?" I said, "Oh, okay. I got it." We didn't expect me to be a black photographer. So I called up my representative and I said, "No, what's happening with Esquire?" He says, "They don't like you." So it hurts a little bit.
When I was trying to find work, trying to sell my photographs, I would take them to art directors, and they were literally shaking when they saw my work. They were not used to seeing black artists. It's like, this stuff does not belong here.
Roy T. Garava was significant to a number of black photographers. I was influenced by his book, and as a young girl, Sweet Flypaper of Life.
Sweet Flypaper of Life.
Flypaper of Life.
Sweet Flypaper of Life. Flypaper, which was everybody's Bible at that time.
It was one of the first books that I saw, a concise work of black people's lives in a positive way.
Which I stole from the library, I admit it. I had to have it.
When I wasn't thinking, I would just kind of pull it out and I would just flip through the pages. I would read it. I would go backwards. I would go forward. It was attached to me for a very, very long time.
Whoever did this, I want to go meet this guy. So I actually came to New York to meet Roy DiCaravo. You weren't bona fide until, have you been in New York to see Roy yet? You know, everybody had to come and sit up under Roy.
The wonderful thing about photography is that it escapes these time zones. And you look at a photograph and it's now, it's not then.
There was a point of view and a point of reference that had to do with this deep undercurrent of Black humanity that was simply pouring through in those photographs. And I thought, if I could do that with a camera, if I could change the way people thought of the Black subject vis-a-vis the photograph, then I had a great, great, great responsibility, and that I could walk in the footsteps of giants.
My mother emigrated to this country the year that Emmett Till was killed, and so that she was in total shock. And when I was growing up, she would never let us go to the South because if that's what happened to Black children, she didn't want her children to be there. All the guys who went to photograph the Emmett Till trial knew that they were going to intervene in a political, legal process by bringing the cameras to the place.
Ernest Withers, after documenting the trial, he was able to create a little pamphlet. That was an important moment for the press and for photographers during that time.
Mamie Till allowed the Black press to photograph her son, her unrecognizable son, in his casket. It's one of the most powerful images that Jet Magazine ever published. It's one of those photographs that when you see it, you remember it. And when you see it again, it still hurts like it did the first time.
My grandfather used his camera to affirm a vision filled with hope. And the promise of a better future. When my father met my mother, He too entered the world seen through my grandfather's lens. Together with his grandmother, his mother, his sister, her husband, and their child, my cousin, Peggy. Through the camera lens, my father found an image of himself that was not demeaning. My grandfather tried to get my father to join him in taking up the camera, to use its power to construct a community. And a vision of his own making.
The photographers during the civil rights movement were citizen journalists. They were active. They were upset about what's going on within their communities. So they picked up the cameras.
My work focuses more on the spirit of the 250,000 people who were behind Caitlin. I've tried to have a universal message and feeling from a people who are looked upon as being at the bottom of society.
Ernest Withers, documenting the Memphis garbage men strike.
Since I didn't go south, I felt, do this.
Abandoned, without heroes, without a father, left to struggle on one's own, to see oneself as having value, when the world outside only sees a void. How to keep one's humanity in an inhumane world.
how did one more ambitiously use the camera? And how did one take what's out there in the world and come out with one's own idiosyncratic voice?
I am like a filter for spirit to work through me. I find that photography is very spiritual. It has to come from the heart.
I thought if I really woke up fast enough, I could photograph my dreams. I wanted the picture to be always. I wanted to have something in it that would make it universal for everybody.
To become reborn. By holding a mirror to the spirit. To see oneself unbounded by time and space.
When I started meeting the photographers from my generation and younger, their works were centered on ideas of not necessarily the things that people wanted them to work on. They were really working on projects that they were based on their ideas of being an artist.
Deborah Willis.
Deborah Willis.
Deborah Willis.
Deborah Willis.
Deborah Willis. Started doing all these shows and started cultivating the talent, started writing the books, started putting it out there for the public to see.
If it were not for Deborah Willis, we all probably would have disappeared at some point.
Deb Willis made us visible in her groundbreaking book, Reflections in Black. In this book, giving witness to both our beauty and our pain, there are photographs of Cousin Peggy, who has been a muse to my brother Lyle and me, as well as to other photographers.
Somebody sent Peggy to me. I photographed her a number of times. Then one day she was over and I asked her what was wrong. She said that this guy had said to her, you know, you're really very beautiful for a black girl. And by that he meant a real dark-skinned girl. And she was really stunned and hurt.
There's no one model for beauty. And understanding that, it becomes powerful.
Nobody ever sees the tear. There's just one tear that's rolled down her face, but people miss it.
When I look in the mirror in the morning, it's not a shock to me that there's a black woman standing before me. So in some ways, that image is, for me, universal.
I guess when one looks sort of like in the mirror and sees that fractured reflection and can drink up the possibilities of that, as opposed to seeing it as necessarily something that destroys one.
The gun was readily available, and the camera, and I think about that a lot. The camera truly saved my life. You know, it gave me a sense of purpose.
Decisive moment for me in my kind of artistic / photographic career was when my cousin was murdered. Why is it that Black people tend to kill Black people over petty things? There must be some deeper threat that we see in each other.
My son's work as a result of my nephew's death had a lot to do with questioning manhood, questioning the experience of love, what happens to men when they're not loving each other.
At times, the hurt and shame of absence, of rejection, threatened to overwhelm me. But through this journey, I discover reflections of myself that I too can love in the images that connect one heart to another.
I'm always sort of, dealing with ideas about longing and therefore unrequited love. There's always, I think, a tinge of loss that my work ultimately represents, because I'm always really thinking about this idea of how to get you to love me back.
I look for moments that show that we're caring and we know how to share a moment with the people we love.
My face, reflected in their faces. Our gaze meeting across time, giving me the power to use my camera lens, together with my community, to create an homage to an enduring legacy of self-affirmation and self-invention.
We have a responsibility in our image-making capacity, which is where we share the wealth of who we are. We have the responsibility to widen the path, to open up all those possibilities of what Blackness can be. Now.
Then, now, and in a time yet to come. When I was a child, I saw as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But now that I am a man, can I put away childish things? For now, we see through a lens darkly, but then face to face. We may not yet see each other as brother and sister, but in the album of humanity, will we find the vision to come together, to see ourselves as one?